But really, welcome to our today's webinar, Human Trafficking Prevention for Libraries. I'm here to welcome Terri Markham. She is the Executive Director of Uprising, which is based in Sheridan, Wyoming, and she is here to talk about human trafficking prevention opportunities in our public libraries, Wyoming, but also anywhere else in the nation. And before we get started, I would just like to point out, if you have questions or comments, please put them in the question box. And throughout the webinar, Terri will be answering questions, and there will also be time at the end of the webinar if you have further questions or comments. And on that note, we'll get started. Terri, please share with us what you have, the information you have.
Well, thank you. Happy to be here. So today we have 90 minutes together, which honestly, it will go by really quick with all of the information that I have. So I tried to be really thoughtful in what information would be the most pertinent to get to this group of people. And so I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to start out with giving a little bit more information about what trafficking actually is and what it looks like locally. And then sort of the second half or so of the presentation, we're really going to hone in on prevention within libraries. And so what can you do to take action and help keep people in your community safe, particularly youth, is a really big demographic that we try to do a lot of training about. So right now I have a question up on this. This is just to kind of get your mind thinking. So what comes to mind when you think of human trafficking? This is often one of the very first questions that I ask any audience that I am training or presenting to. And I'll give you sort of a rundown of some of the more common answers I get. So a lot of times I hear things like, people think of the movie Taken or the other new movie that's out. They think of crossing borders. They think of a lot of movement because just the word trafficking has the word traffic in it, which sort of implies movement. I often hear that people think of like kidnapping or, the white vans snatching kids off street corners. They think of people in chains, locked up in basements, things like that. And certainly all of those situations could be human trafficking, but that is definitely not what we typically see that human trafficking looks like on a local level here in Wyoming or within our region or the US for that matter. So the very first thing that I want to start with is giving you an overview of what human trafficking actually is, because I think that's a really big key to understanding it. And to start, I want to focus on sex trafficking specifically, because most people, when they think of human trafficking, what usually comes to mind for them is sex trafficking specifically, because that's what we see more commonly in the news, with what we see depicted in movies and stuff like that. And I like to tell people that sex trafficking, it's a lot simpler and more broad than you think. So there's really three main components that we need for something to be considered sex trafficking. The first thing that we need is any sex act. The really important word there is any, because most people automatically assume that it's this traditional penetrative in-person sex act. But there's actually a lot of other things that constitute sex acts. Things like pornography, webcamming, exotic dancing, a lot of stuff that can happen both in person and not in person could be considered a sex act. The second thing that you need is anything of value that's exchanged for the sex act. So again, a lot of people assume that it's always like this cash transaction, and a lot of times it is cash, but not always. Sometimes the thing that's being exchanged for the sex act, it could be drugs, it could be food, it could be shelter, it could be a ride home from a party. With youth, sometimes we see sort of gift items that are commonly used. So it might be the new sneakers, the new iPhone that they want. Again, it doesn't really matter what it is, anything of value that's exchanged for a sex act. And with those two pieces right there, that is what we would consider commercial sex, because there's a commercial aspect to it. And it's really important that you know, on the under 18 side of this umbrella, If you are a minor, both our federal and our state laws say that a minor cannot legally consent to commercial sex. So already, if we have youth who are exchanging anything of value for sex acts, it is already illegal, and they are already a victim or as a trafficking victim in the eyes of our federal statutes. Where it really becomes trafficking, as most people know it though, is when we add in that third piece. And the third thing is a third party who's profiting off of the exchange. So that's your actual trafficker. That's the person who's benefiting from the commercial sex acts that are taking place. And again, there's a lot of misconceptions about the trafficker. Most people assume it's like the stranger danger person that they met, but a vast majority of the time, the traffickers are actually someone who the victim already knows, loves, and trusts, or someone who has taken the time to develop some sort of relationship with them, even if it's a very one-sided relationship and the youth doesn't know it. On the over 18 side, so for adults, it's the same 3 items that we need. The only difference is that an adult legally can consent to commercial sex. That's why we have things like strip clubs and pornography. So with an adult, we have to have a 4th piece. For an adult, we also have to prove that there's either force, fraud, or coercion present. Force is like physical force, so that could be beating someone, raping someone. Fraud are the lies that victims are told. That could be something like, you're just going to have to do this for 6 more months until we get that insurance settlement, and then we'll have that perfect life that I've been telling you. And then coercion are the threats. So that's, if you don't do this, I'm going to release all these photos I have of you and ruin your reputation. Or if you don't do this, I'm going to hurt your children, or I'm going to hurt your parents. So basically, with an adult, we have to prove that they're doing it against their will. And with a minor, we do not have to make that distinction. A minor is automatically considered a victim. So when you look at this, those 3 things that you need, that sort of makes it very broad. There's so many different scenarios of how human trafficking can actually look like. So I'm going to share with you some specific types of sex trafficking that we have identified here locally in Wyoming that we know are happening locally. All right, so the first kind that I want to highlight is what we would call pimp-controlled trafficking. Pimp-controlled trafficking is when we actually have that pimp, exploiter, trafficker, those words all mean the same thing, who are actively out trying to groom and recruit new victims to be sold. What it typically presents like in our communities are victims who are forced to post sex ads online, and then they go and they meet those buyers for dates. It is a very demand-driven type of trafficking. So if I am, let's say I'm in Cheyenne and I'm posting sex ads, I'm probably going to be getting a lot of hits from Cheyenne. I know this for a fact because there's been sting operations in Cheyenne. But I'll probably also start getting hits from maybe northern Colorado, maybe Laramie, some of the surrounding cities. And if I get enough hits from Laramie, then I'm going to go to Laramie and work. When I'm in Laramie and I'm posting, I'm probably going to start getting hits from Rollins. So then I'm going to go to Rollins. And what ends up happening a lot of times with pimp-controlled trafficking is that those victims end up working what's called circuits. Circuits are basically like routes that victims work. So I'm going to jump real quick and show you a picture. This is a picture of a circuit. This is actually a friend of mine who is a survivor of pimp-controlled trafficking. This was her circuit. She lived in northern Colorado, and the very first time that she was able to go out and work a circuit on her own without her pimp coming with her was Wyoming. So Wyoming was kind of her training ground. When she would work this circuit, she would hit all of these cities in our state, and she would never stay anywhere more than 2 nights in a row to help avoid detection. And she never once came into contact with any Wyoming law enforcement service providers. And so this is, perhaps it's more impactful if I tell you also, she worked this circuit on a regular basis for 4 years straight. So this is a really good example of what pimp-controlled trafficking typically looks like. I'm going to pop back to this, whoops, I'm going to pop back to this slide real quick though, because also pimp control trafficking is also the type of trafficking that you would associate with the trucking industry. I know a lot of people are familiar with the fact that trafficking happens in the trucking industry. And it's also the type of trafficking that you would associate with large events. You know, think things that are big like Cheyenne Frontier Days, where it brings a lot of extra people. And actually, there have been historically sting operations run in concordance with Cheyenne Frontier Days because of that very reason. So that's pimp control trafficking, definitely a type of trafficking that we have present all through the US, including Wyoming. And then this is just a little fun fact, if you will, for the people who like the numbers. This is a very conservative estimate about how much money that pimp control trafficking alone is generating annually in a state like Wyoming. So we took our population. We're going to assume that 3% of our population are sex buyers, because in the US, that's 3% of our population are sex buyers. So we have about 17,000 sex buyers in our state. If each one of them spent $100 on 10 sex acts a year, which is an average from Wyoming, that generates about $17 million. If we take off 30% for overhead, because a mature business typically has 30% of overhead, that's still over $12 million that's being generated from this one type of trafficking alone. So that sort of lets you know what the economic impact looks like. All right, the next type of trafficking that I want to highlight is gang control trafficking. I am not from Wyoming, but I certainly didn't move here and think, oh, I bet there's a lot of gang activity. You know, we have these beautiful picturesque mountain towns, and it wasn't something that really popped in my mind. But we do have over 22 identified gangs in Wyoming. And gang control trafficking is actually a type that we get disclosures about. Primarily, those disclosures that come to Uprising are from some of our Native partners who are telling us this is the type of trafficking that they're dealing with on the reservation. So gang control trafficking is very much like organized crime. Usually people who are trafficking, gangs that are trafficking people, they're usually taking part in lots of other criminal activity. It's highly dangerous, and a lot of times survivors don't make it out to tell their story. Or if they do, they're probably not going to tell their story because they're, you know, hiding. They're trying to escape that life. So there's a lot more to be learned about this type of trafficking. And that's really difficult because it's a really hard kind to intercept. Familial trafficking. This would be when it's your family member who's trafficking you. And this is perhaps one of the kind that is most worrisome to me because it's the most common type of disclosure that I receive personally here in Wyoming. So with familial trafficking, when it's your family member who's trafficking you, oftentimes that trafficking is happening right out of your home. You know, you're probably not working circuits, there's not movement. It's just something that could be happening, you know, in the evenings, on the weekends, whatever, right out of your own house. And so a lot of times this type of trafficking can go really unnoticed because when it's happening right out of your own home, it can be really hard to spot. Also, typically the victims of this type of trafficking, they're still living regular lives. You know, if it's a child who's being trafficked, they're probably still going to school. They might still be involved in extracurricular activities. Victims of this type of trafficking, you know, they might still attend church. They might have a job. They're going to the grocery store. They can appear as if they're living just regular, ordinary lives. They just have this whole second life that's happening at home as well. And so think about our small towns. In small towns, everybody sort of knows everyone, right? And that actually can help this type of trafficking thrive. Because when everyone sort of knows everyone, the people who are actually exploiting their family members, they're going to know who they can sell to and who they can't so that they can remain undetected. On top of that, reputations can go a long way in our smaller rural communities. And a really good example of this, actually, last year, there was a city councilman in the tiny town of Grable, Wyoming, that was arrested for exploiting children online. When he was arrested, all the other city council members were like, there's no way that he did this. Like, he is such a good guy. And that's the thing about it. The people who are doing this, oftentimes they are going to appear like the good guy, the person everyone likes, because they're going to gravitate to those types of positions of authority in their communities. However, they're not going to act like, you know, they're doing this bad, horrible thing. They don't want people to know that. So you're not typically going to see that, which makes this a pretty dangerous type of trafficking that can be happening pretty much right under our noses all the time that we're not looking for. I'm going to share another case of familial trafficking in a minute, but I'm going to move on for right now. Online-based trafficking. So again, if the picture in your head was that there was this in-person physical interaction that had to happen with human trafficking, then you probably weren't even thinking about the fact that human trafficking can happen online. But think of that formula: a sex act in exchange for something of value where a third party is profiting. That could look as simple as a youth meets someone online, that person coerces them into sending illicit photos or videos, and then they turn around and sell them. That right there is technically human trafficking. And what's really scary is sometimes the victim may not even know that they're being exploited in that way. Because a lot of times when it's online based, that victim may think that this person is someone who they really trust, a friend, a boyfriend or a girlfriend or a partner even. And so it can be really hard to realize that they're actually being exploited. But as you can imagine, with the access that we all have to the internet, particularly our youth, this is happening at extremely high rates every single day. So I do want to highlight here an organization, a task force within our state called ICAC. That stands for Internet Crimes Against Children. And I like to highlight them because they're one organization that keeps data where we can really get an idea of how much this is actually happening in our state. So ICAC is a task force that's housed within our Department of Criminal Investigation, and every single state has an ICAC. Some have multiple ICACs. We, of course, have one ICAC. And this team of people only investigates online-based exploitation crimes of children. And so I'm going to flip here. This gives you an idea of how much this is happening. So in 2022, they had 40 arrests. They had 27 child victims that they identified, and they investigated roughly 793 cyber tips. And this is primarily a group of 6 full-time people. In this past year, in 2023, I need to update this. They did more than that. They surpassed the numbers of 2022, and it was over 800 tips that they ended up investigating. So that is like multiple tips per day that they are having to investigate of online-based exploitation. And from their commander himself, right out of his mouth, he often tells people that what's really disturbing about doing this work is that all the people that they're catching, all of the stuff they're investigating, these are not even the people who are really skilled at exploiting kids in this manner. These are what he calls not even the low-hanging fruit. It's the fruit that's fallen onto the ground that they're getting, and they are absolutely inundated by it, so they don't even have the time to be able to be very proactive and try to go after sort of the bigger fish who are probably causing the most harm. So that's something I definitely recommend that you get more education on. If you reach out to our ICAC task force in our state, they are often able to schedule presentations and things like that as well to tell you more about the work that they do. And I would say in this group, you know, public libraries are also the place where people can go and publicly, you know, access the internet and things like that. So it's definitely something you at least want to be aware of how it happens and what these crimes look like. This is some data that I want to share with you real quick. This is Uprising data. So we do a lot of prevention education with youth, and anytime we're working with youth who are ages 12 and up, we like to do anonymous surveys with them. So this slide is a little bit old because it's a little bit more now, but at this time we had surveyed over 1,700 Wyoming youth, and we ask them a whole bunch of questions, and we get a little bit of data from them. So a few things that I want to highlight. Number one, the data is mostly positive. Like, most kids feel safe at home. Most kids don't have any abuse present in their home. Most kids, you know, don't have secret social media. Most kids feel that they have a safe adult. Most kids aren't sending nudes, things like that. That alone is very empowering information for youth to know, because when you're a kid, it can feel like a lot of social and peer pressure. And we have youth who tell us, like, especially when we talk about things like sending nudes, for example, they feel like everyone is doing, like, it's so normalized that everyone is doing this. But the fact is, most kids actually still are not doing it. So just knowing that little bit of information alone can be really empowering for youth. But a couple things that I do want to highlight that aren't great. Abuse in home. This could be any kind of abuse: emotional, physical, substance abuse. Right now, we have about 9% of youth who are disclosing that they do have abuse present in their home, which obviously we'd like to see none. We ask a question about if a youth has ever been coerced into providing a sex act in their own home. So that could be a familial trafficking situation, or it could be, you know, someone who has access to them is abusing them. And it's about over 3% right now who tell us yes. We ask kids if they've ever been approached online in a way that made them feel uncomfortable, and it's close to half of kids tell us yes. But what's interesting on this one, even in like 5th grade classrooms, if I ask kids, how many of you have ever had to block someone, like 90% of hands go up. So I actually feel that this one is a little bit higher. We're close to 14% of kids who say they're engaging in sending nudes. 11% who say they've experienced sextortion, which is when they're being threatened with their nude photos or videos. And right now, the question that we ask that is an indicator of trafficking, we have about 12%. So it's something like 1 in 9 kids are telling us that they have been at least approached in a way that would be considered trafficking. So this is, you know, this just shows us, like, it is here. We do have even youth who are experiencing these adverse things. It's also right on par with a lot of national data. So this is some online-based data from an organization called Thorn, made famous by Ashton Kutcher, who founded it. But they collect data about online-based exploitation of children, and this very much matches a lot of what we see. So this data right here is specific to what we call self-generated CSAM, child sexual abuse material, which is basically the sending of illicit nude photos or videos. So 17% of kids, and this was 9 to 12 years old, say that they've shared their own self-generated CSAM. 15% of just 9 to 10-year-olds have. 32% of LGBTQ plus youth. So we definitely see some of those marginalized populations are exploited at much higher rates because their vulnerabilities, honestly, are probably easier to prey on. Among those who shared those nudes, 50% say they shared it with someone who they don't know in real life, and 41% say they shared it with someone who they know is an adult who's over 18. So it's pretty disturbing data to me. All right. Last couple of types of trafficking I want to share with you. Illicit massage is when we have massage parlors that are offering commercial sex services, well beyond what a massage parlor should actually be offering. I put this on the list because it's one that's come up a lot in Wyoming lately. And actually we have Senator Ellis, who is hoping to introduce a bill again for the 3rd time this coming session to help combat illicit massage. But we've had several busts of illicit massage within our communities. And this is just one that I want people to be aware of, because there's usually a stigma around illicit massage that it's just consenting adults, so who cares? But the fact is that the people who work in these are very much victims of trafficking. And it's actually one of the most horrific types of trafficking that I've seen. And it sort of spans both labor and sex trafficking. And then of course, labor trafficking, because human trafficking is not just for commercial sex, it's also for forced labor. And so on this one, I just want to highlight on this yellow side of the screen, these are some of the top industries within the United States that are known to have high prevalences of labor trafficking. And if you look at that list, we have all of those in Wyoming. Some of them are actually the key industries to our state, you know, things like tourism, service, agriculture, extraction, you know, those keep our state running. And those are known to have high prevalences of trafficking. So if I were to take an educated guess, I would hands down assume that we have more labor trafficking in our state than we will ever have of sex trafficking. I just think it's a type of trafficking that can go even more unnoticed. There's not as much training on how to identify and disrupt this type of trafficking. And it's just an area that we're not really looking at yet. And that's not exclusive to Wyoming. There's a lot of other states that are finally just starting to get on board with really trying to address labor trafficking. And so I think we're right on cue with those. Okay, so here's 3 big reasons why you might not realize that human trafficking is actually happening in your community. Number 1, it is a crime that goes very highly unidentified. A huge reason for this is because the victims themselves, just like we have those pictures of what we thought trafficking was in our head, so do the people who are actually experiencing it. So a lot of times they are not going to self-identify as a trafficking victim. Straight out of the mouth of some of my survivor friends, I have heard things like, I knew that I was experiencing domestic violence, I knew I was experiencing sexual assault, but I didn't realize that I was also experiencing trafficking. Trafficking is almost always going to intersect with other crimes and issues, so it can be really hard to pinpoint. On top of that, it often goes very misidentified, and that's because of that intersection. So we as a community, we might, you know, a law enforcement officer might realize like, hey, this is clearly domestic violence, this is clearly child abuse, but they maybe don't know how to screen and ask the right questions to dig a little deeper to realize that trafficking was also happening. So there's a lot of trafficking cases that are often sort of categorized only as other things. And then on top of that, reporting practices. So this article that you see here is a case of familial trafficking from Gillette in 2020. And I like it because just this little blurb that you see, we have the 3 things we need for something to be trafficking. This just says this man was accused of multiple counts of sexual assault for abusing 2 girls in Gillette over the course of several years. Mother has been charged with promoting prostitution for allegedly setting up her daughters to be sold. So in this, this man is actually not the trafficker. He is the buyer. He is the one who's creating the demand here. The mom is actually the trafficker. She was setting up her children to be sold to these buyers, and that's how she was making ends meet. So I see this all the time, cases like this all the time. This is technically trafficking, but if you were to click on this article or read any of the other articles around this case, you would never have seen the words human trafficking. And a really big reason for that is, well, number 1, reporters have to report the way charges are filed. Charges in this case were filed as sexual abuse of a minor. That carries a really hefty penalty in our state, and prosecutors have a lot more experience with prosecuting those types of cases. So they're more likely to feel confident that they can put this guy away for a long time. We actually haven't ever prosecuted a human trafficking case at the statewide level in Wyoming. We have had cases go to prosecution, but so far all of our trafficking cases have been able to go to the federal level, so they haven't had to be prosecuted by state prosecutors yet. So there's a big lack of experience with prosecuting these cases, so it makes sense that they might go for a charge that they feel more confident they're going to be able to execute. All of that leads to, you could have human trafficking be front page news in your community, and you still might not realize that trafficking is actually happening. So that's why stuff like this is important. Community education is really key in this fight. Okay, we're gonna switch gears a little bit because I just gave you a whole bunch of information, probably a lot to keep your head swimming on what trafficking actually is, what it actually presents like in our communities, and why people might not realize it was happening. Now let's switch gears a little bit to talk more about your specific role in working at public libraries. There is a lot that you can do. The library in itself is a huge protective factor. It's a safe space for people to go. It's a place where people, all different types of people in the community, come to frequent, do programming, all of that. So what are some things that you can really do? And I particularly want to take the time to highlight youth in the second half of this to help reduce any sort of exploitation that might happen with youth or community members wherever you're at. So the biggest thing here, and you'll probably hear me say it over and over, is we can empower them with information. Not just youth, all people, but really especially youth. One of the biggest things we can do is really empower them with information. For me, that really means not scaring them, not telling them like, this is bad, don't do this, because that doesn't really work well with youth in my experience, but instead building them up, highlighting the positive, creating those safe spaces so that youth can really thrive. And the other thing is when youth are very involved in their communities, they're less likely to have more time to even meet that potential exploiter. So let's dig into this a little bit. And this is where I usually surprise a lot of people, because most of the time when I'm doing education and training surrounding trafficking, I tend to spend most of my time not talking about trafficking itself, but talking about sort of all of these upstream thoughts and ideas that could prevent trafficking from happening in the first place. Because the truth is, if it's already happening in your community, it is very hard to address. The people who have already experienced this are going to be dealing with it for the rest of their lives. And it is heartbreaking to walk alongside someone who's experienced exploitation and see the struggles. We are much better off trying to prevent it from even happening in the first place. All right, so this is a little game. Since I can't really see anybody and I haven't seen anyone type in the chat, I'm not gonna make you guys play it. I'll just give you the lowdown of this. I like to use this to break up the time and get you guys interacting a little bit, but this is a game that we play with youth when we are talking to them in middle and high school classrooms. Typically, it's called Guess the Exploiter. So usually I have the youth sort of profile the people that they're seeing, give me their first impressions, and then I ask them to guess which one is the exploiter. And in this batch of 3, hands down, most youth usually will pick the military guy as the potential exploiter, which is kind of interesting to me. Same thing on this set. I have them profile them, and then I have the youth guess. And on this set of slides, they can't get past the first guy. They call him, he usually gets dubbed creepy uncle. And the kids usually, by and large, think that he is the exploiter. The truth is, though, that it's sort of a trick for all the youth, because all of the people here, these are all real traffickers. They are real cases. Like, you could go and Google them if you want. They're not local to Wyoming, they're around the US, but all of these people are exploiters. So we have this young guy, college graduate, we have a grandmother, we have a military guy. This first guy is an accountant, we have a high school cheerleader, we have a reverend. All of them were exploiters. So obviously the moral of the story is you can't just tell what an exploiter looks like. It could literally be anyone in your community, from your own peer to the trusted person who does all the volunteering things. It could literally just be anyone, a grandmother, a parent. And so if we can't just tell who someone is, we need to do other things to help equip our kids to keep them safe. So one of the first things that I always tell people that they can do is address vulnerability. We all have vulnerabilities. every single one of us. For kids, just the fact that they're young with underdeveloped brains is a vulnerability. A vulnerability often is seen as a weakness because it's something that someone else can take advantage of. But the thing is, I don't really think about it as a weakness if we all have them. And I actually think vulnerabilities can be really empowering, because if we are able to help, especially youth, but other people in our community, identify what their own vulnerabilities are, then they're going to be less likely to be preyed on with that specific vulnerability. You know, if I know I really struggle with, I don't know, anxiety and depression, and someone comes along and they're really just picking at that vulnerability, I'm going to be more likely to question their motives if I know that's a vulnerability that I myself have. So one of the big things that we can do is create opportunities to explore vulnerabilities within our spaces, within the public libraries. What could that look like for you? Could it just be taking some time each year and highlighting vulnerabilities, maybe 1 week, highlighting books, having activities, having handouts and resources? Could it be to do some programming surrounding vulnerabilities? Could it be to have a vulnerability week where you're just highlighting different kinds that are common within your community? You know, putting up a poster and having people write what makes them vulnerable. It could really be anything simple like that, but getting people to talk about it, getting people to address it, getting people to look inward and think, what are my vulnerabilities, is what we want to see here. And a huge reason for that is because the grooming process. You've probably heard this word. It's not, unfortunately, it's not like grooming your cat or your dog. This grooming process is a process that an exploiter or a trafficker will use to basically prepare you to eventually be exploited. And it literally starts. Step one is they're going to identify someone by their vulnerabilities. So they are going to look for that vulnerability and they're going to use that as their in. This could be something as simple as a kid makes a post on social media. Ugh, my parents are so lame, they won't let me go to this party. I can't wait till I'm 18 and I can move out. That right there is showcasing vulnerabilities. And that is an in where that trafficker can send them a message and be like, I totally understand. My parents were so strict when I was your age too, but you know what? Now I live in Denver and it's amazing. Maybe you can come visit sometime. You know, it could be something as small as that, that's showcasing that vulnerability. The next step of grooming is building trust and gaining information. So after they have that initial in, then they're going to spend a lot of time getting to know every little thing about this potential victim. This is the area where I think there's a really high chance for other people to maybe realize grooming is happening, because typically in this area of grooming, where there's building trust and gaining information, it is going to look like the victim is spending all their time in this new relationship. So if it's an online thing, they're probably on their phone 24/7. They might pull away from any friends or existing support systems they have because they're spending all this time with this person. And to them, it's going to feel great, because it's going to feel like, hey, here's someone who wants to spend all their time getting to know me. They ask me all these questions. They really care about me. Usually we see exploiters will also do what we call love bombing in this stage. So that means that they are just showering this victim with praise and love. And you know, that feels good to anyone, especially a youth with an underdeveloped brain. But that feels amazing. So one way you can sort of combat this, I'll just say it's really hard to recognize that this is happening to you if you're the one experiencing it. But it's very empowering for youth, especially, to be charged with, you can keep an eye out for your peers by looking for love bombing, by looking for grooming, because almost all kids, when I'm at a middle and high school classroom, will raise their hands and say that they recognize these signs as something either they've experienced or someone they know has experienced. So they know this, they just don't know the word for it. They just don't realize the danger in it, but they know what it is. So in this get to know you phase, how you can sort of help someone maybe take off the rose-colored glasses is help them take stock of that relationship, because typically what you're going to find is the exploiter is learning all this information about the victim, but the victim's not actually learning anything substantial about the exploiter. So perhaps, you know, a child is telling them everything about school, their family, their life, their hopes, their aspirations. And when they turn around and ask a question, well, tell me about your work. They're usually met with something vague. Oh, you know, my work is not that interesting. I'm just in business, but tell me more about you. They're going to deflect because they just want to learn and uncover more vulnerabilities from that victim. They don't actually want to give any real information on themselves. The next stage of grooming is filling the needs. So as they're doing that, building trust and gaining information, they're uncovering all other kinds of vulnerabilities, you know, sort of the cracks in this person. And when they go to filling needs, they're going to try to fill those cracks with themselves. You know, so if it's a youth who's living in a single parent household and that parent has to work 3 jobs, maybe that youth is disclosing that they're really lacking like that encouragement and that love from their parent. So that's what the exploiter will likely try to give them. A really big one that I see most commonly is that the victim is lacking that romantic partner. So the exploiter is going to give them what we call the girlfriend experience or the boyfriend experience, meaning they're going to pretend to be in a romantic relationship with them. This whole process is already isolating because, again, that victim is typically going to spend more time going inward with this exploiter and cutting off the rest of the world. But on top of that, the exploiter will also work to isolate the victim as well. So if they do have any existing support systems, they're going to try to cut those off. You know, that could be as simple as like they get into a fight with their parents and the exploiter will probably blow it up, make a big deal. I can't believe your parents treat you like that. They clearly don't understand you at all. It's going to be so good when you can just get out of their household and live your life with people who understand you. You know, they're going to sort of try to undermine and cause a lot of friction and tension in those existing relationships if they're there. And then finally, it's going to get to the point where they actually ask them to do the inappropriate thing, where they flip the switch and they try to exploit them. And if they've gone through this whole process, that child or that person is now more likely to actually do what they're asked because they feel they really care about this person, they love them, they've probably burned a lot of bridges, they don't have any other people they can go to, so they're kind of left with like, well, what are my other options? The other thing I want to point out, this grooming phase, a lot of times I will see pornography introduced. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But pornography sort of desensitizes people, especially youth, so that when they ask them the inappropriate ask at the end, it's not as shocking. And then the other thing that I like to point out is that the timeline. I have seen grooming take months and months. I've literally seen exploiters who are waiting for their victim to hit their 18th birthday, and they took months. And then I've seen it happen in minutes. It seems like the younger the youth, the shorter amount of time that it takes to groom them. And so this can happen in a very short, quick amount of time, or it can take a long time. With grooming, again, think of how we can empower youth with this information. The big thing is just giving them all the information up front, helping them to know what they're dealing with so that they can maybe recognize red flags if this is happening to them, or like I said, recognize that it's happening to their peers, to their friends, to their siblings. That in itself is really empowering. I think good ways to potentially highlight grooming, especially in a public library setting, resources are huge. Like Uprising, we have posters that talk about grooming. We have grooming resource cards. You know, these are things that you can have displayed, that you can have around, that you can, you know, highlight and elevate and give out so that people understand it. And then again, talking about it. How can you highlight this? How can you talk about it within your libraries and where you're at? Because we all want to keep, especially our youth, safe from this. Online, I gave you guys all that scary information about online. Really, the online-based stuff just comes down to to simple online safety. How are you highlighting online safety within your libraries? You know, what can you do? Can you offer periodic workshops where maybe you have someone like the ICAC team or Uprising come in and lead some workshops on online safety for the youth? Can you have posters and resources around on how to use online spaces safely? If you have youth who are just coming in to use computers and devices, can you create like a program where maybe youth have to go through an online safety course before they're allowed to use that technology? Just trying to think creatively about how you can infuse a lot of online safety into your space in really simple, easy ways. And of course, this is always something that myself or my team is happy to, you know, work through with you and, you know, come up with ideas that would work for your individual spaces as well. I touched on this a minute ago, but pornography. This is probably my #1 soapbox right now, because if you take something like human trafficking, the whole reason it exists is because there is a demand for it. There is a demand. There are people who want to purchase a child for sex. There are people who want to do that. And so they are the ones causing the problem. Because there's a demand, we have the traffickers who are absolutely willing to make money off of it and provide that victim. And so a lot of the work I do, I kind of see myself as a preventionist. I told y'all that I do a lot of prevention education, particularly with youth. But the thing about prevention is I'm not just trying to prevent future victims of this crime. More than that, I'm trying to prevent the future buyers of commercial sex, because they're the ones actually causing the problem. And so how do I prevent that? My job has been really interesting. I didn't know when I started doing this work 12 years ago where it was going to take me. But one of the things that I've gotten to do in recent years is actually participate in sting operations where buyers of commercial sex are arrested. And I've gotten to interview those buyers at the moment they were arrested. And I got to ask them, like, what brought you here today? How did you end up purchasing sex? How did you learn to purchase sex? Like, what has driven you to want to do this? And a lot of what I've learned from those buyers who've spoken to me is a lot of them, actually, I'd say 100% of them have pornography addictions. And what we know about pornography from a scientific lens is that it's very much like any other drug. The more that you use it, the harder and harder stuff that you're going to need to get the same high. And so that's where we get people who start getting into maybe more taboo subjects of porn, and eventually that doesn't even do it for them, and then they want to purchase sex in person. And so it can snowball. And so for me, how I can get in front of trafficking and make a dent in human trafficking is actually to teach youth about the harms of porn, because I have found in our work that it's not something that a lot of people are talking to them about. The data now shows that the average age a youth is exposed to hardcore pornography is by age 11. Data also shows that pornography is affecting our youth in all kinds of ways, including a huge spike in peer-on-peer sexual assault, where we actually have kids who are sexually assaulting younger kids as a direct result of the very violent pornography that they're getting exposed to. We also have things like data that's showing that boys as young as 16 are experiencing erectile dysfunction because of pornography addictions that have started. And so it's just really scary. The data out there about pornography absolutely shows that it's extremely harmful, physically, emotionally, mentally, extremely harmful, yet nobody is warning our kids. We're all just kind of hoping that they're not going to see it, they don't know what it is, and maybe I'll get through until they're 18 without ever having to talk to them about it. But the fact is, now that they all have those little devices, they can be exposed to this at super young ages. I've had youth that I've worked with who told me, I actually had a young girl who told me at age 9 she was addicted to porn. And so it can absolutely happen. So again, this is a really hard topic to address. But if anyone can do it, I think public libraries are a great place. I would point everyone to a resource called Culture Reframed. Culture Reframed is a website you can visit. They have absolutely amazing data from wide study samples that can help equip you to talk about the harms of porn. And on top of that, they have amazing resources. They actually just launched what they call their porn critical sex education, that anyone can go on and they can get this free curriculum and they can lead a cohort of youth through porn critical sex education. There's also resources for taking your kid through like sex education, porn critical sex education. So definitely check it out. It's something that we have to address. And there's honestly, there's even a lot of great books. I have seen books like Good Pictures, Bad Pictures for kids as young as 4 that help address porn in a very age appropriate way so that kids know it's dangerous without scaring them or exposing them to stuff that is, you know, taking their innocence away. So there's lots of ways to talk about such a taboo subject in an age appropriate way. Understanding feelings and emotions. This may seem really simple, but this is huge because kids need to understand. We always tell people your gut feeling is the biggest indicator that something is off. So learning to understand their own feelings and emotions is huge. Also, going back to that demand piece, and when I have been able to interview the buyers of sex, one of the biggest reasons that they say that they're there is because their marriage is falling apart, their work stress is too high, you know, their kid is not talking to them. Basically, a lot of people who are going to purchase sex are doing so as a coping mechanism for something that's going wrong in their lives. And so where is that coming from? I think a lot of it is coming from that we're not teaching people how to have healthy coping mechanisms. We're not teaching them how to emotionally regulate themselves. So a lot of this, it may feel fluffy, like, oh, feelings and emotions, but this is actually really key, basic prevention. For me, you know, we love to just talk to kids about, like, again, how to trust your gut, how to understand, like, when my palms are getting sweaty and my heart rate's racing, that could be an indicator that I'm getting stressed or that there's danger or I'm uncomfortable. So a lot of this work, I love doing this work with really young kids, like elementary age, is really fun, but there's ways to adapt this kind of work to any age group, even adults. Healthy relationships and boundaries. If you are in a relationship with a potential exploiter, guaranteed it is not going to be a healthy relationship. There's going to be a lot of unhealthy behaviors. So one thing that we can do is teach people the difference between a healthy relationship and an unhealthy one. And you might think it's obvious, but I'll tell you from personal experience with youth, it is not obvious. There's a lot of nuances. There are things that I ask youth, like, let's say your partner demands to have all the passwords to all of your social media and all of your devices. I will get youth who say, oh, that's really healthy because they care about me and they want to be looking out for me. And then I'll have some youth who recognize it as, actually, I think that might be unhealthy, like that they're really trying to control you and see every part of your private life. We have things like your partner texts you 50 times a day, all throughout the day, constantly. And I'll have youth again who are like, oh, that's really healthy. They care about me and they're checking on me. And then I have the ones who are like, I don't know, that seems a little excessive. Like, you've got to have your own life too. So don't always assume that youth are going to recognize the healthy or the unhealthy relationship quality. We have to help them because practice makes permanent. So making sure that we're calling out healthy and unhealthy. So this could be something, I mean, in a public library setting, I feel like you could do some really fun, cool things. You know, maybe you pick a smattering of books and you highlight them that month and you talk about, like, this book really showcases healthy relationships in these ways. or even the opposite. You can also call out the unhealthy relationship. You know, Twilight, that's like the book of my like young adult life that I loved, but I absolutely recognize a lot of unhealthy relationship qualities between Bella and Edward. So how funny would it be to take like popular books and call out the main love interest and be like, okay, this person's great, but really, let's look at these things. These seem unhealthy. And that could be a really fun activity that you could have people help you with in your library, and then you could highlight it. And I'll tell you, once you sort of ruin that for someone, that doesn't go away. You know, even though I still love Twilight, every time I watch that movie with my kid, now that she's wanting to read the books, like it's in the back of my head, like, yeah, but this is really unhealthy. And it kind of takes a little bit of the romance away. Be a trusted adult. This might seem obvious. And I would imagine that a lot of you in the libraries, you know, you probably are this for people in your community, whether you realize it or not. But that's one of the biggest things I think we can do is just be trusted adults for kids. What that really means for me, number one, we absolutely respect youth and their boundaries and their bodies. You know, I'm not running in and touching every kid that comes through my doors. If I'm a hugger, then I'm like, hey, can I give you a hug today? Because I want to showcase consent. I want to respect their boundaries. I want to respect their bodies. I'm listening and responding to their concerns. So I'm going to be as good of a listener as I can. I'm going to create opportunities for youth to give me feedback so that I can listen and learn from them. So maybe that could manifest itself as like a youth council for your libraries, who they're helping you to shape some of your youth programming. That could look like a youth input box or a youth input night that you host quarterly, where youth tell you, this is what we want to see in the library. This is like what we like to do. Here's how we like to come here and hang out and what we want to have. Be an informed resource. So you're doing that right now. Learning about all the things that you can that affect your communities, so that you know what's happening. You don't have to know everything about every subject. I definitely don't expect you to get off this call and be a human trafficking expert, but you now know this is something that does happen in my community, and there are some ways for me to be proactive about it. And then modeling and explaining to other adults. For me, one of the big things is I feel like kids are always listening and watching, whether you realize it or not. So calling out people sometimes in a very respectful way. You know, someone says the really inappropriate thing, the very victim blaming language maybe, I'm going to call them out on that, because I know youth are always watching, and I want to model so that they see like, hey, this is not okay. And it's okay to tell someone that this is not okay and that that's offensive. Again, there's lots of really neat ways that you can do this. Here's some do's and don'ts for you. Perhaps you've created a really safe space in your library. Perhaps maybe one day you're going to highlight anti-trafficking efforts more in your library. That could absolutely lead to disclosures. As a matter of fact, the more that you do this work and aim it towards youth, you can almost expect to get disclosures. So what do you do or not do when you get those? Number one, definitely listening. Do more listening than talking if a youth is disclosing to you about a situation that they're in. Check your body language. I like to say that people, especially people and youth who've experienced harm and abuse, they have a superpower. They are able to sense kind of like your mood, because they had to do that to survive. Like they had to know when Dad walked in tonight, I knew I was, you know, he's in a bad mood and I might get a beating if I don't stay out of the way. That's just the unfortunate thing. So if a youth is disclosing to you and you've had a real stressful day and you're strung out, like that might be a time to say, you know what, I'm kind of in a bad space. Can we finish this conversation tomorrow so I can be present? Do label unhealthy behaviors, because again, don't expect that the youth are going to realize the unhealthy behavior. Do talk about consent. That's huge. An exploiter is not going to respect consent. That is not something that's in their vocabulary. They're not going to ask for consent. They're not going to model consent, but you can. Do not question youth. Sometimes you might have to ask a question, especially if they're revealing to you or disclosing about a situation that could put them in danger. Obviously, you're a mandated reporter, but when you are able to refrain from asking questions and just letting them tell their story, that's the best, because oftentimes they're not going to tell you the whole story at once. That's where I have do not expect the whole story. They're going to give you little pieces and test you out and see how you do with it. See if you're shocked. See if you run and tell someone before they give you the whole story. Try not to react poorly or like shocked or crazy, because that might be enough to cut them off from telling you further information. And again, don't expect the youth to realize the unhealthy relationship. You might have to say, wow, it sounds like the person you're telling me about might be in a pretty unhealthy relationship. And then here's why. So call that out. Okay. On top of everything else that we talked about, I don't have a slide in here for it, but just the fact that libraries sort of are this safe space. Again, I want to highlight the people, anyone can experience exploitation. There is no demographic for a victim, just like there was no demographic for the exploiter. So no one is safe from it. However, we do see marginalized populations that are exploited at just significantly higher levels because of their vulnerabilities. So as you're creating the safe space in your library for all people, you also need to go out of your way to make sure it's especially welcoming for those other populations. The LGBTQ+ youth are a huge one. Homeless youth is perhaps the most high-risk demographic that we see. Native youth are a really high-risk demographic. What are you doing to make sure that they feel especially welcomed into your safe space? How are you highlighting those populations so that they know, like, oh, this is a place I can come to where I'm welcome and I feel safe? So I just want to throw that out there. This here is some of the youth programming that Uprising offers. We love, love, love doing programming with youth. So our programming, some of it is stuff that we can come out and teach and be invited in. Some of it is stuff that we can teach you to do on your own. And some of these are programs that are just national programs that anyone can access and become a facilitator of. So a couple of them that I'll highlight: after school workshops. That is one where we can train people how to do after school workshops. That's something that would be really cool to see in public libraries. Summer camps, we actually have summer camps for elementary and lower middle school age youth at this point. And that, again, it's a curriculum that we can just give over to you and you can lead that. White ribbon weeks, that is something that was actually intended for schools, but I think libraries would be a really cool place to do it. It's kind of like a red ribbon week, but instead of highlighting being drug-free, you're highlighting online safety. And there's not an actual week of the year that you do it. You can do it any week that you choose. The VR experience, that's something that Uprising has, that we can come to your library. We have 10 VR headsets now, and we do this experience for anyone, but it's particularly impactful for youth, where it actually puts them into the shoes of a 14-year-old victim of trafficking, and they get to learn how this person ended up in this space and why they can't leave. And we've had youth get off this 10-15 minute experience and tell us things like, wow, I was really nervous that the trafficker was going to walk in and hurt me. They're showing empathy. We've had youth tell us, like, I think I'm going to delete my Snapchat now, just because of what they saw in this VR experience. It's really neat. It's a neat way. And we find that youth retain the information in the VR much better than they do like in a PowerPoint presentation, because your mind actually keeps it almost like a memory. So those are just a few programs. All of these are on our website. So if you go to our website, you can see all the different programming we can do. You can request speakers. We also have a whole youth section that I would recommend you check out. There's resources, there's information, explains the grooming process, some of the stuff we talked about today. Really good stuff on there. And then this is our information. So this is how you can get in touch with me. That info@uprisingyo.org, that is an email that goes directly to my inbox. Again, I'm the executive director for Uprising, so if I would love nothing more than to coordinate with more libraries. I'll just say I'm a huge fan. I love our public libraries. I think you're safe spaces. And anything I can do to support you and the work that you want to do, please don't hesitate to ask. We are definitely a huge ally of y'all's. And so please, yeah, reach out. And we finished a little early, mostly because I can't see any of you and we couldn't really interact. So it was just me talking and flying through information. But if anyone has any questions at this point, I'll just say anything at all about human trafficking, anything I talked about, feel free. You can throw it in the question box. I'm happy to answer any questions right now. Otherwise, I hope to hear from you soon, and please reach out.
Thank you, Terri. Yes, I am going to, let's see if we can unmute people. Oops. I'm not sure what screen everybody is seeing now.
I see your go-to event details screen.
Okay, let's stop showing that. I'm trying to unmute everybody here, so if you want to ask some questions, you certainly would be able to. Okay, and I don't see any questions in the question box. I do have a question myself. So these programs, such as the White Ribbon Week, is that something that we just call you or email you and say we want to start this? Is there training involved, or is it just the package of things that you send? How does that work?
Each one of those programs is really different. The White Ribbon Week in particular, that is one that someone developed out of Utah. So you can just Google White Ribbon Week and you'll be able to find that curriculum. It's just a curriculum that you purchase. Uprising has gotten one grant through the Department of Health to launch White Ribbon Weeks in Sheridan County. So we can purchase the stuff if you live in Sheridan County. Otherwise, right now, it'd be sort of on you to purchase that. But each of those programs are different, and all of them I have information on. So even if it's not one of our programs, you can still reach out to me, and I can give you like, hey, here's the connection that you need, here's the website, here's the successes or challenges we've had with these programs.
Okay. Okay, because you mentioned that schools, that some of these are actually geared towards schools, but really the main audience is youth. But I also work with school librarians, and so this could be something, you know, a little more far-reaching. So,
and I love, like White Ribbon Week in particular, it's like, how do you address trafficking and exploitation with elementary kids? That can be hard. Like, we really have to be, you know, cautious. I'm not going to go in there and even say the words trafficking to really young kids. So something like the White Ribbon Week, it's just like 1 week of programming where typically like a homeroom teacher, first teacher of the morning, you know, they go through a 10-minute lesson with the kids. And then there's posters and stuff throughout the day, and there's like an optional lunch activity. And it's just a really simple thing to introduce the concepts of online safety. And so I like that because I feel like we need to be getting some of that stuff, our kids exposed younger and more often, so that by the time they get to middle and high school and I'm talking to them, you know, they have some base of knowledge. Because right now what I'm experiencing is like, oftentimes I'm the first person to talk to them about a lot of these topics. And that's, to me, it's crazy because a lot of them are also telling me that they're already experiencing some of these things.
Well, and when you mentioned unhealthy boundaries, I mean, that is a huge thing that is so often overlooked. And I've even had people say to me, oh, I hate talking about boundaries. What, you know, it's like a buzzword or something, but it's a real thing. And oftentimes in families, boundaries get blurred, and unhealthy relationships are kind of the norm. So I think that would be a really good thing to even delve into boundaries in relationships and friends.
Absolutely. And there's just so many I love getting to like work with a group or a person to come up with a creative way to address a topic like boundaries. Like with boundaries, like here in Sheridan County, we teamed up with our equine therapy program, and we developed a program called Pony Prevention, where the elementary and middle school kids come out, they work with the ponies, and they learn boundaries. And so they're making like physical boundaries and shaking the food, and the ponies are blasting through it, and we get to have conversations about when hard boundaries and soft boundaries are appropriate and those kinds of things. So it's just, there's so many cool ways to address all of this stuff where you don't have to just be preaching at kids. You can do it in really fun, engaging ways. And that's what I love about this work.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I like the idea that you had with the books and talking about, new current literature, but kind of exploring the dynamics of the characters and the boundaries. And I've done that with TV shows, especially TV shows from the 70s that, okay, growing up, I'd watch these and it was normal, but now looking back is like, whoa, that is terribly unhealthy. And yeah, I think that's fun. It's a fun exercise.
Yeah, we do a lot of talking with youth about social norms.
Mm-hmm.
And so we'll throw up like advertisements or song lyrics from like popular stuff. And it's funny because it's like a song everyone knows and sings along to, but when you actually read the lyrics and think about what they mean, you're like, wow, this is so unhealthy. And we're just, and again, I love doing it, especially with my kids, because it ruins it for them a little bit. I'm like, oh, okay, you can listen to that song, but first we're going to read the lyrics together and talk about what it means. And then from that point on, they can never hear that song the same again. It's like in the back of their head, they're thinking, I know what this is really talking about. So all of that goes a long way in the end.
Yeah, so it helps them identify that and builds trust with an adult. But also if somebody does come and start trying to love bomb or any of those types of behaviors, they're more apt to recognize what it is.
Absolutely. That's what I want above all else. Mm-hmm. I want when this red flag behavior happens, I want kids to be like that be dinging for them, like, oh, wait, let me just stop and assess because that was a red flag. That in itself is huge.
Yes. Well, thank you. I so appreciate you coming on and sharing this with us. For everybody listening, this has been recorded and it will be posted on the Wyoming State Library YouTube channel. So check there after today. And the link will go out to everybody who has registered. And
thank you.
If nobody else has anything to say, then you get a few minutes back in your day. And again, thank you for joining. Thank you for sharing this very important information. And I hope to talk with you again soon, Terri. This is really fascinating and important for our youth.
Thank you so much for setting it up, Paige. I really appreciate it. And again, just anything we can do. If you want to bring an in-person presentation to your community, like we've done tons of presenting through libraries, like reach out to us. We would love to do that. And we travel the state constantly. So like we're usually pretty good about like, oh, we're going to be in this town on this date. We could come and do a presentation while we're already there, so that it's not costing anyone anything.
Do you have an email list or anything that people can join?
Yep. If you go to our website, which is just uprisingwyo.org, there's, I think, towards the bottom of the page where you can join our email list and you can stay up to date on, upcoming events and stuff. We typically will send an email out about once a month.
Okay. Okay, great. All right. Well, thank you again, Terri. Thank you, everyone, for joining, and have a wonderful day.
Thank you.